Wondering how to do calligraphy with a Crayola marker? Learn how in this video. Crayolas are widely available, low cost, and fun to use. In this tutorial, we'll show you how to get thick and thin strokes, which are important for calligraphy. You'll learn the basic strokes of calligraphy, and we'll also show you how to write the alphabet. But first, a quick warning about the biggest mistake users make when doing calligraphy with a Crayola, and that is you're probably going to try to write too fast. So as you're going through this, and if you're trying it on your own, just remember to slow down, and we'll give you a lot more tips in this video. So Crayolas work well for calligraphy because you can get both thick and thin strokes. And there are two ways to get thick or thin strokes. The first way is by changing the angle of your pen. Because the tip of this marker is like triangular shape, if you just use the very top of that triangle, you'll get a thin line, and if you write on the edge of it, you'll get a thicker line. And in order to write on the edge, you can see that I'm changing the angle of my pen. So perfectly upright to the page gets a thin line, and then we can bring it closer and closer to like almost laying flat on the page, and that changes our thickness. And the other way you can do it is by adding pressure. So if I pick an angle somewhere in the middle here, so not perfectly upright, not all the way flat, but somewhere in between, and this time I'm actually going to keep the marker at the same angle the whole time, but what I'm going to do differently is press down harder. So now I'm going to press a little bit harder and a little bit harder, and then as hard as I can. So by keeping the pen at the same angle, I can add pressure and get this variation in thickness as well. So when you're writing in calligraphy, you wouldn't want to be constantly changing the angle of your pen so drastically. It would just be really hard to write like that. So you want to be able to create thickness by adding pressure. I'm also going to mention that usually when I use a Crayola for calligraphy, I kind of do a combination where I am actually slightly changing the angle of my pen while also pressing down. So when I'm making thin upstrokes, my pen is slightly more angled towards the top. When I'm pressing down, I try to make it slightly more angled this way and also add pressure. So you can also do a combination of these two techniques. In the first technique, we changed the angle of the pen. And in the second technique, we changed the pressure. So I want you to practice getting thick and thin lines. And the thin lines are actually going to be really easy to get, so you probably don't need to practice those very much. But what I would practice is being able to get thick lines and being able to get them a constant thickness. So up here, I was showing you that you can change the thickness with the amount of pressure or angle, but here I just want you to try to get a constant thickness. After that, if you want to try alternating between thin and thick, notice that every time I'm making a thin stroke, I'm going in the upward direction, and then thick strokes, I'm going down. Also, remember the tip that I said at the beginning about slowing down? When I was showing you these, I was going pretty fast, so just slow down. If you have ever tried brush pen calligraphy, you don't really have to press that hard to get thick lines. With a Crayola, you actually have to press really hard to get thick lines, and I personally usually hold my pen pretty lightly and don't press that hard. So for me, getting these thick lines is actually pretty difficult. Like I feel like I'm using a lot of pressure. So I do have a few tips for you that I kind of figured out while I was trying to work on this, because I was just getting frustrated because my thick strokes were not that thick. Now we're going to talk about the basic strokes of calligraphy, and these are the shapes that you'll use to make the letters. The first one is called an entrance stroke, and it's just a thin curved line coming up. The second one is called an underturn, and it's a U shape, and we're coming down on the left with a thick line and then curving to thin on the right. So you'll notice this is the first time that we've actually transitioned from a thick stroke to a thin stroke. So the next one is going to be the opposite of this. I'm going to start here, come up, and then around, and then now I'm starting to press down as I'm coming down on the right side. So that's called an overturn. Next we have an oval, and the oval comes down on the left so it's thick, and then up on the right so it's thin. And I'm trying to smoothly transition between thick and thin here. Then we have, this shape is called the compound curve, which comes up thin, down thick, up thin. Now we have a shape called the ascending loop, which comes up with a loop thin, and then this downstroke here is thick. Then we have a descending loop, which is the opposite, so a thick downstroke, coming around with a thin line. And then the 8th basic stroke that we like to teach for modern calligraphy is we call it a reverse oval, which is used in letters like P. So if you have ever tried calligraphy and you've tried brush pen calligraphy and you've done the basic strokes before, and if you're still struggling to get the thick and the thin lines, I started giving you a few tips about how to get more pressure, either by actually just having to press harder with your hand. If you end up pressing too hard though, it can cause some problems. So I'm going to show this underturn again here, and if you press like super hard at the top, then you can get some problems with transitions, but also what I was actually trying to show on that one didn't turn out too bad, but at the top, sometimes you just get like a lot of extra ink pooled in there. Or if you're doing a shape like an oval and you end up pressing too hard. Okay, I'm not getting these mistakes. Right here, I was actually using marker paper. This is like printer paper. So let me try again. If I press really hard at the top, you can see the effect more right here with that ink pooled there. And then if I try to press too hard, sometimes the marker kind of like gets stuck. This is what I'm dramatically trying to show you here, is if you press too hard, you can also run into problems. There are some other things you can do if you are struggling to get thick strokes. One of them is to hold the pen a little bit farther back than you normally would. So that should make it a little bit easier to be able to draw on the side of the nib, which is where you're going to get that thickness. You can also try to write at a smaller scale. So if you're trying to make these basic strokes like really big and you're wondering why it doesn't look like there's much contrast, it might just be because they're too big. And then you might also have to adjust your pen grip a little bit. So for brush pen calligraphy, I usually hold my pen something like this. For Crayola calligraphy, sometimes I actually have to hold the pen completely differently, like put my thumb over my index finger just so that I can press harder without hurting my fingers. Or you can think about kind of rotating your hand in a different way. So if you naturally hold it like really upright like this, you can kind of rotate your hand so that your thumb is more up rather than to the side. And that could help with the angle like this. Another way that I wanted to mention that looks kind of weird, but it actually works, is if you hold it in between your fingers. Now, again, this looks kind of weird, but I actually found that it works pretty well because I'm not really pressing that hard, but I'm still able to get really thick lines. So this could be worth trying. This will also allow you to get thicker shades, which could allow you to write at a bigger scale. So if I was trying to write something in calligraphy with a Crayola at a larger scale, I would actually probably hold my pen something like this, and then I would probably rotate the angle of my pen as I'm going. So notice how now I'm kind of leaning my pen more to the side and then back up. So it makes it easier to do that pivoting too. You'll have to work on areas of transition like this right here, so there's no gaps. And then before we get to the alphabet, I just want to show you one more option. Crayola actually does have different kinds of markers too. So the one that I was using before is just like their regular one. There are other ones that are called pip-squeaks, where they're just shorter, and then they also have super tips. So the pip-squeaks, the nib of this one is the same, but I actually find this one a little bit easier to use because it's easier to hold at that angle that allows me to get thick strokes, because this part almost like rests kind of in my finger right here, like in this part of it, so it's more angled. Smaller pip-squeak and the super tips, the actual size of the nib is smaller, so you could also try using these. With these, the thin strokes will be thinner. That was the pip-squeak, and then this is the regular super tip. So those are some different options depending on what feels comfortable to you or what you might have lying around. I have two girls and they have a huge set of art supplies, so I actually grabbed these from their art supplies to use for this video. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to write the lowercase alphabet using Crayola markers. Normally for calligraphy, we recommend using printed guide sheets so that you have a straight baseline to work with and a slant angle. But for Crayolas, because they're just really fun to use, you don't have to worry too much about being perfect. Crayola calligraphy is kind of similar to brush pen calligraphy. After we do the alphabet, I'll show you brush pens. And both of them are forms of modern calligraphy. Using a Crayola marker is a great starting point if you wanted to try calligraphy. It's just a really easy way to get into it and start experimenting with using pens that you can get different thicknesses and starting to develop some pressure control. Now, if you really want to become like a master of calligraphy, you're probably going to graduate on to some other calligraphy pens and other tools. But again, these are a really good starting point. As you're watching this, try to pay attention to the basic strokes, see if you can point them out. And also, if you're trying this on your own, remember to go slowly. Remember to think about thick strokes and thin strokes. Again, just as a reminder, all the thick strokes are in the downward direction and thin strokes are in the upward direction. Oh, another quick tip is you might find it useful to rotate your pen as you go, because if you keep pressing down on the same side the whole entire time, then the nib kind of becomes like slanted in one direction. So just out of habit, and I do this when I use brush pens too, I just like to rotate the pen as I go. Another reason these are fun to use is because they come in a lot of colors. I got the box of 40 and just have a big variety of colors, but you could also just get I think it's a 10-pack is the original. Usually you can find it for a pretty low price at even generic stores, not specialty art stores. If you're wondering about paper, I'm using marker paper just because it's nice and smooth and it works really well for markers. You can also just use regular printer paper. With brush pens, we don't recommend using any regular paper because they're a lot more sensitive, but the good news about Crayola markers is that they are a lot more durable. You can even use them on construction paper, and they will just last a lot longer without worrying so much about only using smooth paper. And with Crayola Calligraphy, I usually write my letters a little bit more in a modern style that's more upright and usually a little bit wider compared to in a script like copperplate. My letters are usually more slanted and narrower, but I think that this style works really well for Crayola Calligraphy. Now let's compare Crayola markers with brush pens for calligraphy. So this is a Tombow dual brush pen, and it has a brush tip which is very flexible. Both a Crayola marker and a brush pen have a triangular shaped nib, but you'll notice that the brush pen nib is a lot narrower, and the tip is also way more flexible. So with the Crayola marker, we talked about how to get pressure by pressing down really hard. Now with a brush pen, this is what a thin line looks like, and I can press down. I'm actually not really adding that much pressure at all, and it's getting this really thick line. Let me show you what it looks like if I were to add the same amount of pressure that I was using on the Crayola marker. So you can get really thick lines. Also, if I hold it at an angle that is lower to the page and press down, you can get extremely thick lines. Now, usually when I do calligraphy with a brush pen, the thick strokes are about this thick, so almost the same as the thickness of the Crayola. But with the Crayola, to get that thickness, I'm pressing down a lot harder and, again, kind of angling my pen. So I'm going to write the basic strokes for you with a brush pen, just so you can see how they work. And a lot of beginners especially find the Tombow dual brush pens kind of frustrating to use because it is a lot harder to get thin lines. You can even see here in some of my thin strokes, they're not that thin, like this is kind of thick in this area. And that's just because they're so sensitive to pressure. So even if you're trying really hard to create a thick line, even if you just press down a little bit here, or if you're trying to get too thin of a line, it also doesn't end up looking that good. So that's some of the reasons why, especially Tombow's dual brush pens are a little bit challenging for beginners to get used to. You can also see here this little white area inside that stroke. This pen I've had it for a while, and it's a little bit frayed at the top. I mentioned this before with brush pens, it's important to use smooth paper so that this doesn't happen. It will over time naturally happen, but using smooth marker paper will just make your pens last longer. I'm going to show you another option here, which is the Pentel brush pen. So the tip of this brush pen is a lot smaller, but it still is flexible. The smaller tip allows you to write at a much smaller scale. So if you find it hard to write at a larger scale, then a small tip brush pen like this might be easier for you to use. Also, compared to the Tombow, it's a lot easier to control. It's a lot easier to get thin lines. It's also relatively easy to get thick lines. So the Pentel might be a great investment after trying out the Crayolas as a starting point. Pentels are a really great next step. And these are actually the pen that we recommend most for our beginner membership, which is called Calligraphy Skool. So in Calligraphy Skool, you have access to tons of printables, a beginner course, and other members to learn with. You get new practice words every month. You also get a variety of quote designs to trace. And these are great because you can get started with creating beautiful work right away without practicing for months and months and having nothing to show for it. You can just, in your first week or your first day even, you can print out these quotes and just follow the numbers and arrows. It's really super easy to get started. We also have themed workbooks, and we do seasonal workbooks. So like for Christmas and Valentine's Day, we give you workbooks that have lots of calligraphy designs for you to practice and also to use. So each design comes with a copy that doesn't have the numbers and arrows. So if you just wanted to trace it and then hang it on your wall or give it to someone else, then you can do that too. We add new worksheets every month to help keep practice fun, and we'd love to have you there. So just check the description of this video for the link to join Calligraphy Skool. I hope this Crayola calligraphy tutorial was helpful for you. Please feel free to leave a comment or like this video, and make sure to subscribe for more.